What happens when a single night breaks the rules that ruled an entire plantation for generations? A whisper in the dark would not stay buried. Lady Margaret Ashford, 28, managed acres and led a household with a precision that smelled of lemon oil and ledger paper. The summer air on the Mississippi plain was thick, the river a warm, slow ribbon, moss swinging from live oaks like tired curtains. A new man arrived to the slave quarters, quiet as river mud and carrying a secret that would change inheritance, law, and the lives under Ashford roof. You will stay until the end to learn how a private act became the seed of something that echoed for decades. Subscribe and watch how a single choice can tilt a history. Ashford Plantation sat low and wide along a bend in the river, with white columns piercing the heat like punctuation. The house was called a manor by visitors and a seat by those who worked it, but to Margaret it was a ledger, a responsibility, and a silence wrapped in lace. She had inherited the property when her father died, the titles and accounts landing in her lap like a gauntlet. She was trained to negotiate prices, to speak with merchants and with overseers, to count the rows of the cotton at dusk, and to judge whether the rains promised harvest or ruin. Her hands were accustomed to paper and ink, but not to the rough calluses of the field. On the veranda, she kept a small library of texts, volumes shelved not for leisure, but for the control that knowledge gave her. The smell of ink and lemon oil was as familiar as the clink of silver at the dining table. The household had routines that moved like clockwork, from morning prayer with Pastor Samuel Reed to the afternoon inspections with Overseer Thomas Bell. Margaret grew up within this order. Her mother taught her to balance the books and to keep the house immaculate. Her father taught her to look at fields as numbers rather than lives. Yet there were stories at night, told in low voices by the seamstress Martha and by the midwife Hester, about ancestors who traveled by river and sang songs that spoke of other lands. Those whispered threads were kept hidden from ledger and law. Margaret learned early the language of command. She was both gentle and exacting, a paradox in a corseted form, and she carried a private loneliness that taste could not disguise. She wanted respect. She wanted the plantation to run. She wanted, in secret moments, to feel a human warmth that had nothing to do with registers and estate taxes. The slave quarters lined the opposite side of the yard from the house, low cabins with smoke darkening their eaves. The people who lived there had names and crafts that mattered to one another. Ruth tended to the younger children, her laugh like chimes under the pines. Liza was a seamstress, who mended more than clothes. May lasted through winters in a way that impressed even the overseer. Annalise carried cautions and a calm that made her the one others consulted. Jonah arrived in a cart with 2 other men, his wrists bruised from travel, his eyes steady. He was not from the neighboring counties, everyone knew. When Margaret first saw him, she noted the way he held his chin like a man used to being watched. The overseer reported that he was literate, that he had read small slips of paper in the market and traded in ways that suggested more than muscle. That detail was dangerous, like a spark in dry straw. Literacy under slavery was a rule violable at great risk. It became the crack that let other things in. The arrival of Jonah was the incident that set the story in motion. It happened on an evening when the cicadas sang loud and the sky felt near. Jonah worked in the fields by day and in the storeroom by night. He carried with him the scent of river clay and tobacco, and when he looked at Margaret across the yard, their glances were brief, measured, and loaded with things neither of them would name aloud. Their first real conversation occurred in the library after a storm. The porch was wet, the veranda boards slick, and Margaret found him standing by the racks with a fragment of a book in his hands. He had stolen a moment of time, and a stolen time would not stay hidden. Margaret, I found that book missing 2 nights ago. Jonah, I found it on the lane. It looked like someone had dropped it and not cared. Margaret, you should not be handling those volumes. Nor should they have left it where the wind could take it. You read it for a while in the barn a fortnight ago. I read by the moon because the day is for work. Do you know what the law says about men like you reading? I know what a line in a book can do to a mind. I have slept with the words. That is dangerous information to keep. Knowledge is a sort of freedom. You keep a ledger. I keep a page. I keep more than a ledger. I keep lives. Lives are kept beyond ledgers as well, Miss Ashford. Call me Margaret. Margaret, then, and Jonah, 2 names on the river tonight. Their exchanges continued in low tones, each sentence a negotiation. Over the next weeks, they spoke in the dusk by the river, in the dark under the live oaks, always careful of the capataz and the routes of the overseer. They read to one another, Jonah speaking lines from journals and Margaret reading legal opinions, a clandestine exchange where words became a forbidden currency. The senses of these meetings were sharp. The river smelled of silt and clay and life. The air tasted like green leaves and distant smoke. Hands lingered on the same page, fingers brushing, the touch both an accusation and a comfort. The sound of the quilting needles in the workroom would sometimes carry across the yard and then fall away, leaving their voices small and urgent. They traded stories of ancestors who had crossed oceans, songs that Hester hummed while she stirred tea of bitter herbs, phrases of law that Margaret had learned and Jonah had adopted as if to armor himself. Backstory of Margaret demanded its own weight. She was not born to cruelty. She had been trained to take over a property that the family name expected to preserve. Her education had taught her how to calculate taxes and how to speak to bankers. She felt the legacy of her father in the way the parlor portraits watched her. Those portraits were of men with steady jaws, men who made decisions about people they barely met. The sense of duty sat heavy on her shoulders. When her mother died, she became the steward of a system she rarely questioned. At night she would walk the veranda and feel the heat of the lamps and wonder about the absent intimacy. Her loneliness had a contour that tasted like lemon oil and ledger ink. In the small hours she would think about leaving, but the weight of inheritance pulled her back like a tide. She believed in order and in the importance of family name. She had a fear of scandal and a love of control that shaped every decision. Jonah carried his own past like an animal in his coat. He had been taken from a place his mother had once named in songs, land that smelled of cassava and river reeds. When he was young, he learned to read from fragments left by sailors passing through the docks, from a merchant who had taught him the letters for reasons of trade. He hid that ability because to be known as literate meant danger. He learned healing from Hester, who saw in his hands a gentleness that suited midwifery. Jonah had seen cruelty and had a stoicism that could be mistaken for calm. His father had been a man who planted stories into the ears of his children about a life beyond the fields. Jonah held that as a kind of hope. In quiet moments, he would trace the lines in his palm and think of how different the future might be if knowledge could be spread like a seed. As their secret deepened, it became less about passion and more about mutual risk and solace. They shared confidences and small rebellions. He taught her to read a pamphlet about abolition that had slipped through a trader. She taught him to draft a note that could keep a worker from being sold by paperwork alone. The plantings of intimacy shifted into a reckoning of power. Those who watched in small ways noted changes. Ruth brought a loaf of bread to Jonah and lingered. Liza sewed a cuff on Jonah's shirt and looked at him with new tenderness. The midwife Hester began to speak about omens at night, about a lineage that could not be broken. The overseer grew suspicious because the cotton rows were not the only things changing on Ashford Plantation. At approximately one-third of the way into the story, a turning point asked the audience to decide and to speak. The question is this: if you were Margaret in that dark room with a book and a man who read like a river, what would you choose? The choice may not be simple. Comment beginning with "I would have" and tell us what you would risk or what you would protect. Your thoughts will be read and will shape the conversations we bring to the next episode. The debate matters because stories like this are not just history. They are the reasons we argue about freedom and legacy today. Now watch as the secret moves from two people into a community challenge and as consequences begin to take shape. The pregnancies began as whispers. Women in the slave quarters who had been steadfast and whose bodies were private began to bulge like hidden moons. Annalise noticed first and told Hester in a hush. Hester checked and knew at once what the signs meant. The rumor spread like a breeze blowing through cotton, the kind that rustles leaves and silver coins in bowls. At first, the overseer dismissed it as gossip. Then several women stood up from their matting by the river with swollen bellies that could not be denied. Margaret felt the first prick of unease when Ruth came to the house and said nothing but left a note folded in thin paper. The note said, "I need help." Margaret found herself in a place where private acts overlapped with public consequences. Her duty to property clashed with a sudden intimacy that had been part of a hidden life. When the names started to align, the truth was more inconvenient than any ledger. Confrontations between characters became inevitable. Margaret spoke to Jonah in the storeroom with lamps tilted low and moths circling the wick of the candle. Their dialogue thickened with fear and accusation. Margaret, why would you do this when you knew the stakes? Jonah, I did not plan it. I lived what life offered me. Margaret, you have jeopardized more than reputation. Jonah, have I not seen more jeopardy than you can imagine? Margaret, mothers will be punished. Jonah, then let them punish me instead. Margaret, the law will not be kind. Jonah, the law is what it is. Do you understand what inheritance means here? Jonah, I understand what mothers mean. Margaret, you speak as if that balances anything? Perhaps it does not, but it is true. The conversation carried the weight of both love and accountability. It included 8 exchanges that each exposed differing moral objects. Instinct. Jonah faced the reality that his choices, however personal, created a chain of exposures beyond the private room. The moral conflict intensified as the community learned and as the overseer grew angrier. The first major moment of tension arrived when a frightened neighbor reported rumors to Edward Ashford, Margaret's brother, who had arrived from town. The community gathered with Pastor Samuel Reed presiding over a meeting at the parlor where the chandeliers threw small suns onto the polished table. Accusations circulated and voices rose. There were 2 to 3 paragraphs of stifled memories and choices as both Margaret and Jonah remembered their pasts and tried to decide what to do next. The pastor spoke of sin and order. The overseer spoke of punishment and sale. Hester stood and named the pregnancies and the midwives who could testify. Others in the room remembered the songs of ancestry and the possibility that these children might embody resistance. The moment required choices about exile, about punishment, and about protection. Margaret felt the fabric of her life tearing at the seams, the inherited certainty of the house giving way under the weight of new truth. Then the supernatural thread unfolded. Hester, who had never spoken much of prophecy, told of an old song taught to her grandmother about children born of river blood who would carry a mark of freedom in their first cry. She described how the river had been used by ancestors to move people and to send messages, how certain births had coincided with fog that smelled of wild mint and with birds flying in patterns that were not normal. The community reacted in different ways. Pastor Samuel said such talk was dangerous and superstitious. Overseer Thomas called it madness. But some, including Ruth and Liza, felt an ancestral pulse when they held the new infants and heard their small keening. Those who were named as secondary actors stepped forward. Martha, the cook, offered pots of broth and watched the children with a gaze that was part suspicion and part wonder. Miguel, the capataz, who had served the estate for 2 decades, reacted with an awkwardness born of having to enforce laws he had followed but not created. Edward Ashford, who had been primed to restore order, found himself puzzled and increasingly unsure. The village physician said nothing in public, but examined the children privately and left with a look that mixed curiosity and dread. The phenomenon that made the wider region speak began with small things. In the middle of a dry week, a rain came that smelled faintly like citrus and ash. Birds did not flee the storm. Babies born that night had a thin silver thread of hair at the base of their necks and a cry that some said echoed like 2 voices. News traveled to nearby plantations. Rumors shifted from scandal to omen. Townsfolk gathered at the riverbank to look at the children as if early eyes could determine destiny. Some believed the children were cursed and should be hidden. Others believed the children were a seed of emancipation. The divided reactions made the plantation a microcosm of a larger debate. Margaret stood in the doorway watching the harvest wagons pass, thinking of legacy and law, and wondering which mattered most. The second major moment of tension came when Overseer Thomas attempted to enforce sale of some of the pregnant women in order to alleviate the financial risk. He organized a list and called it By Necessity and Profit. Jonah confronted him in the yard, and voices rose so the entire yard heard. Thomas, they are property and must be treated as such. Jonah, they are flesh and mothers. Thomas, you speak of things that will ruin a business. Jonah, business has ruled too long. Thomas, you act as if you can change law. Jonah, I act as if we can change what people are willing to accept. You are dangerous. So were laws that kept children chained. Their confrontation was public and filled with the sound of work tools lowering and the hush of people listening. 2 to 3 paragraphs followed where memories of past beatings and the faces of mothers came like a tide. It was a test of wills as Capataz Miguel and Edward Ashford stood on either side of the argument. The result temporarily prevented sales, but brought the plantation to a standstill as neighbors mulled the precedent. As tensions escalated, so did small displays that were hard to explain. On some nights, the river sang a note that people said sounded like a lullaby. Some of the infants slept in ways that seemed to recompose the air. People began to tell stories of ancestor spirits who watched and protected. Pastor Samuel, who had once been adamant about sin, found himself moved by the children's presence and began to preach about mercy. He did not change the law, but his words altered some hearts. This shift caused murmurs in town councils and among merchants who feared instability. The plantation that had once been a place of routine now felt like a pressure point in a wider cultural strain. The climax arrived on a market day when rumor overflowed into an attempt to forcibly remove some women for sale. The square outside the plantation gate swelled with people, merchants drawn by the chance of violence and by gossip. Jonah stood between the cart and the women with his hands open. Margaret arrived at the center of the square with a parchment she had composed to protect some in law. Her voice shook, and the air was sharp with heat and smell of dust. Their dialogue in that moment lasted long and fierce. Jonah, you risk everything by standing at my side. Margaret, I risk what I will not allow sold. Do you know what the law will do to us both? I know law, but I also know the lives I keep. Then do not pretend order is the only thing that matters, Margaret. And do not pretend that defiance will not cost us, Jonah. Then let the cost be known, Margaret. I will not watch mothers dragged. Then stand with me now. The exchanges were a series of blows of thought and feeling. The crowd held its breath as the capataz Miguel moved slowly into the middle and then stepped back, uncertain where loyalty should lie. 2 to 3 paragraphs of tension filled the scene with memories for both protagonists. In that moment, an elder named Grandmother Etta sang a verse in an old tongue, and some of the crowd seemed to incline toward compassion. The sheriff from the county arrived, and, after hearing both sides and seeing the zeal in the faces of those present, chose to postpone any immediate sale, citing disorder. The moment shifted the narrative. It did not produce final acquittal, but it bought time. Time allowed for consequences that rippled. Some of the children were baptized in secret by a sympathetic clergy member, and others kept in private care by Martha and Hester. The media of the time, however, began to whisper, and the story of the strange births and the scandalous liaison traveled to nearby towns. Merchants recalculated risks. The planter elite debated whether such events represented a threat to social order. Margaret faced ostracism from certain social circles, but also found empathy in surprising corners, including unexpected letters from women in town who had known loneliness of their own. Jonah became both reviled and revered in different quarters. The enslaved community found in these children a symbol and a problem. They were tender with the infants and terrified for their future all at once. Ephemeral moments became structural change. 1 month later, there were small acts of protection. Margaret had arranged legal documents that kept certain families from being sold, a difficult and morally ambiguous act that used the very tools of the system to shield some of its victims. She lost invitations and the respect of some peers. Her brother Edward wrote a cold letter and then a warmer one, wavering. The community adjusted routines to care for the infants. Hester taught new mothers how to feed. Martha prepared broths that fortified both body and heart. And Ruth and Liza organized watches at night. The midwives and elders taught songs to the babies, so that if their names were changed, the tune of their ancestors remained. 3 months on the plantation saw a subtle transformation. The children grew stronger. People began to whisper that the presence of these infants had made the river feel different. Some laborers petitioned the overseer for better conditions by naming the welfare of the children in their pleas. 6 months later, the longer arc became clearer. The region had not yet changed its laws, but the Ashford household had. Margaret kept her position, but reoriented the plantation practices in small ways that made a real difference. She arranged for quiet lessons for certain enslaved people who wished to learn to read, always under cover and with risks calculated. She persuaded a few neighboring farmers to hire midwives at better wages. Pastor Samuel adopted sermons that spoke more about compassion than exclusion. Jonah, who had once been a quiet man in the fields, became a teacher in small circles, reading aloud at night to those who dared to listen. The children grew into little things who learned both songs and letters and whose very existence complicated business as usual. By the 6-month mark, more neighbors had made private pacts to prevent the sale of families and to quietly improve food and medicine supplies. The legacy of these months extended beyond the immediate household. Grandmother Etta, who had sung the old verse, became a keeper of memory and a symbol of ancestral continuity. The county record showed a few transactions altered by the presence of sympathetic witnesses. Rumors of the children and of the curious storms had reached towns where abolitionist pamphlets traded curiosity with curiosity. The story of a single night had expanded into debates about freedom and the cost of breaking silence. The children did not become a political movement overnight, but they were a starting point. They taught those who cared for them how to imagine other futures. Margaret paid social costs, but gained an understanding of what it meant to wield power with conscience. Jonah paid a cost too, but found in community a new role that drew on his gifts. In the end, the plantation kept its name, but its shape had changed. The ledger remained, but now included notes written in margins about care and about education, things that had not been counted before. People would tell versions of the story for years. Some told it as a cautionary tale about disorder and sin. Others told it as an origin story of small emancipations and of children who had been born under strange lights and who carried in their first cries a stubborn insistence on life. If you were moved by this story, subscribe for more episodes that trace the ripples of such moments in history. Comment with "I would have" if you imagine a different choice, and tell us why your path would have been different. The final image is simple and sharp. On a late autumn evening, Margaret stood on the veranda, the river reflecting a sky that looked like old paper, and she watched Jonah playing with a child whose small hand clutched a scrap of a page. The plantation lights were low, the harvest had been taken in, and the air smelled faintly of smoke and mint. The cost of desire had been high, and the cost of change had been dear. But the tiny, ordinary acts of protection and the unexpected births had marked a new line in the sands of that place. Sometimes revolution began with a choice that a single woman made in a quiet room, and that choice touched more than two hearts. Sometimes the legacy of a field was not only cotton, but a lineage of names that would not be erased.